topic this evening is Dungeons and Dragons as performance, which you and I know a little bit about. We both bring a theater background to Dungeons and Dragons. So I thought we could talk about it as practitioners, but also as fans of following Dungeons and Dragons live streaming and podcasts. So what it's like to do it and what it's like to enjoy it. With your permission, I'll start off with just a little bit of sort of the history of D&D and performance, the relatively brief history of D&D and performance.
Exactly, yeah.
So there's a thing with Dungeons and Dragons and theater have what in zoology they would call convergent evolution, right? Convergent evolution is when...
hold on. Those are really, really big words. Can you...
Yeah, I'm going to break it down. I'm going to break it down. Don't worry.
Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah. Sorry. So in convergent evolution, you have animals that might evolve completely independently from each other, but they end up having some similar adaptations, and they can even look and behave quite similarly, even though they're not closely genetically related. So birds, bats, insects, pterodactyls all developed flight, but none of them are really in the same genus. And I kind of feel the same way about role-playing games and theater. Like they sort of incubated on their own, but they arrived at some similar qualities, despite the fact that until recently, there really wasn't a lot of cross-pollination between these two things. So, for instance, the first role-playing games, really, that anyone can sort of credibly document as happening were invented in theater, right? In the 1930s and 40s, an actress educator named Viola Spolin, primarily as part of the WPA, she developed the earliest example of what we would probably recognize as role-playing games. They were improvisational theater games, and they were primarily used as a training device for theater, but they were unmistakably games. And some of them are entertaining enough to watch that they're sometimes played by actors for an audience. But they contain a lot of elements of what we would recognize as being role-playing games. But the actual playing of these games really did not spread beyond theater practitioners into the general public. And it's unlikely that the creators of D&D knew about them or, had heard of Viola Spolin. Their form of role-playing really evolved from military-style war games involving miniatures in the late 60s into the early mid-1970s. Characters in fiction are portrayed as playing Dungeons and Dragons quite early in the game's emergence, as the popularity really explodes in the late 70s and early 80s. So you see the kids in the movie E.T. are playing D&D, for example. More recently, characters are playing it on Stranger Things and Community, The Big Bang Theory, and so forth. But I bring that up only to draw the line between that and what we're talking about tonight, because those are actors playing characters who are playing D&D.
Right.
Today, we're actually talking about people actually playing D&D for an audience, not doing it as part of a, within a frame of a show.
Right.
So as far as
non-scripted, essentially.
Non-scripted, exactly. Good way of putting it. As far as Dungeons & Dragons for an audience, I could be wrong, but really the earliest example I found of this was Acquisitions, Inc.
Yeah.
Which started as a podcast in 2008. It's sort of right when 4E was rolled out. And it has since evolved into other media, but it was a podcast first. And it's one of the earliest examples of Dungeons and Dragons actual play as entertainment in its own right. It was a collaboration between Penny Arcade and Wizards of the Coast.
And what a genius move of Wizards of the Coast, I think specifically Christopher Perkins, to go to Penny Arcade, to Jerry Holkins and Mike Krahulik, who are very talented individuals, but extremely funny, like just brilliant, funny individuals. And I think that it lends, we'll get into this a little later, but I think it lends itself well into the areas that we just described of improvisational theater, and therefore, to some degree, improvisational comedy, with those kinds of mindsets of those two, that they were the first, at least within recent memory, to take on the idea of, even though it's not necessarily within a live theater perspective, of recording the sessions that they had of learning Dungeons and Dragons creating these characters, which are just ridiculous and off the wall, and having them go through, I believe, at least a portion of Lost Mines of Fendelver at some point. But earlier than that, some relatively small encapsulated adventures.
Yeah, and I think it was really groundbreaking show, right? And partially, it was sort of the medium had finally arrived where you could do that.
Yeah.
Because particularly in 2008, Dungeons and Dragons was not in a place where that concept was getting on television, or even terrestrial radio. But
it would have been very strange to have, turn your channel to 99.5 and listen to a Dungeons and Dragons game. That would
sure. But it is an audio, or at least it was, originally a totally audio show, or it was a podcast.
Yeah.
But podcasting, we were sort of really like 5 years into podcasts being a thing. By the time we get to 2008, and it was a way for anybody to distribute their show. And they were right? Because this is a concept that's been very widely imitated, and they were really the progenitors of it. And they had and have a quite respectable following. But in 2014 and 2015, the game really changes with two shows. In 2014, you get the Adventure Zone podcast, which is a D&D actual play podcast with the McElroy brothers and their dad, Clint, famous for My Brother and Me. That's launched in 2014 by the Maximum Fun Network, and they too play through Lost Mines of Phandelver as a start, but it quickly becomes their own thing, and that becomes a hugely popular and successful podcast, and it reaches very much a non-gamer audience, right? Starting through the sort of fandom that the McElroy brothers already have, and Maximum Fun Network, and that brings in a lot of new fans, and that's sort of D&D starting to kind of go mainstream. And they launched it. It's like that summer 5e comes out, and like a month later they're playing Lost Mine of Phandelver in 5e as like the first episode of that show.
And I think Griffin McElroy must have had some immersion into, at the very least, an earlier edition of Dungeons and Dragons playing, because you can tell just from the kind of exuberance that he has in the first session of bringing this all together with his brothers and his dad, of the real energy, knowledge, play style that he's done this before, right? This is not his first D&D.
I think all of them, with the exception of their dad, Clint, seems like they have some acquaintance with Dungeons & Dragons. And I believe that they had talked about D&D on My Brother and Me prior to that show, and had even maybe done, I think the first Adventure Zone was actually like, this is a very special episode of My Brother and Me. And then they decided to spin it off into a D&D show. And then in March of 2015, the real game changer, no pun intended, the most popular D&D actual play, Critical Role, launches on Geek and Sundry, featuring a group of professional voice actors. As of January 2021, the first episode of Campaign 1 of Critical Role has been watched 15 million times on YouTube.
That's nuts. That's nuts. Wow.
Yeah. And this really is orders of magnitude bigger than Dungeons and Dragons performance has ever been before. They really catch lightning in a bottle, and it really creates a new kind of Dungeons and Dragons fan, which is a fan who enjoys Dungeons and Dragons in a way I think that maybe can be a little tricky for hardcore fans to understand. They're sort of enjoying Dungeons and Dragons in a more passive way, that you can be into watching other people play or listening to other people play Dungeons and Dragons without necessarily being a player or a DM yourself. But you can still be very devoted to following this game being played by other people to the point where you're, buying their merch and attending their live shows. And of course, many of their fans are playing and running their home games. But it really creates this whole other thing that's never really existed before, where there are non-player fans of Dungeons and Dragons that are enjoying that game in a different way.
I think what we find with Critical Role, at least, and you sort of, first of all, it's absolutely shocking to me that 15 million people have viewed that episode on YouTube. But I think that the concept of having non-player fans enjoy that kind of entertainment speaks to the charisma that they exude, not just as, because they could come in real serious, real,
Sure.
Not to use the word in a derogative sense, but real LARPy, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And not have a connection with the audience, which whether they know D&D or not, needs to understand the story, needs to understand who these people are in real life, and so that they can feel like they would play or even watch any game with these folks just because they're having fun doing it.
Yeah. They have so many qualities that are all essential, and it's so amazing to have them all present on one show.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the audience feels like they know them and they are their friends and they are have some sort of genuine human connection to them. The fact that they are funny without fundamentally eroding the sincerity of the show.
Right.
They're funny usually within the, sometimes whatever, Sam Riegel will kind of break the show a little bit, but fundamentally the humor derives from the sincerity of the story, and they approach the story pretty fearlessly.
Right.
As far as how vulnerable they're willing to be, the risks that they're willing to take on camera without really taking themselves all that seriously.
Mm-hmm.
But they bring the commitment and the openness of very good actors to that game.
I think one of the massive pluses that Critical Role had going for it, even when it first started, is that these folks had already been playing, albeit a different system. They were playing Pathfinder and from when we first got together. But they had already been playing the game for I think 3 years when they first started streaming the game on Geek and Sundry. And so the introspection from our point of view is, these people are really good. And the behind the scenes is, they've been working at it for 3 years. One, trying to create the group sort of connection, because some of them had known each other in a sort of tertiary sense and gotten involved in the game because this person said, hey, let's get involved with the game. And then, it's a relatively small knit community in the voice actor community, whatever it is. Yeah. But altogether, their group charisma, for lack of a better word, it exudes from them because of their connections that have already been so ingrained.
Sure. I just want to stop you for a second, Matt, because I noticed we're joined by Andy.
Hello, Andy.
Hey guys.
Hi, Andy. So I don't know how long you've been on, Andy, but we've been basically discussing Critical Role and how great it is, and how many things they do right. And I think you're right, Matt. They were playing, and they were really not playing with an eye towards being a performance.
No.
Initially, right? They were just playing.
But they are performers, so it just sort of naturally came about.
They bring those performers' instincts to the game.
Yeah.
Which is something I do want to get into later, because I think there's one that's there's something that a lot of people I think miss. A lot of other streamers miss about that with regard to Critical Role. But just quickly clearing up the rest of the brief recent history of D&D's performance. So Critical Role that's March 2015, and that spawns really the universe of streaming games that we now have today. In 2016, we got the pre-taped web show Harmon Quest with Dan Harmon, and the live stream Dice Camera Action, which was DM'd by Dungeons & Dragons adventure designer, the lead adventure designer, Chris Perkins. Those are probably the third and fourth most popular shows. Dice Camera Action imploded in 2019 due to scandals involving cast members. Harmon Quest is notable as being a D&D game performed by comics in front of a live audience, but then the game sections are edited and made into a cartoon. So the finished show is a very interesting sort of mixed media of, it's a live show in front of fans where they're playing, and the fans have enjoyed presumably a lot more material than we're seeing on the polished show, because it's then edited in post. Right. And the cartoon is all post-produced. So the finished product that's on screen is a mixture of a live game being played for an audience and cartoon sequences depicting what's going on in the narrative, which I think is also a very interesting twist on Dungeons and Dragons' performance. It's I think a little bit of an evolution. Obviously, it's not a super sophisticated or expensive animation style. If you haven't seen that, it kind of reminds me of how they adapted the Ricky Gervais show on HBO. They took the podcast and made sort of very simple cartoons out of it. But I thought that was a really effective, funny show. And that kind of brings us right up to today, where we've gone from a thing that did not exist 13 years ago to something that we're now kind of swimming in, right? You kind of can't swing a dead cat without hitting somebody's actual play Dungeons and Dragons podcast or Twitch show or YouTube show. And now even Facebook is getting into the act. There's sort of some natively hosted streaming Facebook Dungeons and Dragons shows. So I'm assuming that now I know, Andy, you and I kind of got back into it when a lot of this was already in place. Is that true of you, Andy?
Yeah, for me, I had a friend on Facebook who liked this show called Critical Role. They knew Matt Mercer, and they were friends with Matt Mercer. And I was like, why would people watch other people play Dungeons and Dragons? And so I put it on YouTube and obviously got addicted. I didn't think it would work. And I know to this day, when I still talk to people about it, they're like, how do you watch people or listen to people play D&D? But obviously we do, because it's incredibly compelling.
Yeah. And to me, it seems like a more reasonable thing to watch than, say, watching people play professional poker. But that's also a going concern. You know, people will sort of watch personalities do nearly anything, nearly any kind of game. But this is sort of a new form of performance. Now, conversely, Matt, I think you more so than myself and Andy had continued to play D&D, right? So you were sort of, you kind of had a front row seat to this, as it developed.
Yeah, I think it was a very interesting concept to sort of, as these things were coming out, to watch the difference in play styles. I think that for me was really integral to not only myself but many other dungeon masters, to sort of take on the idea that your game doesn't need to be just so technical, right? And so specific, that it could really involve a lot of story weaving and bringing in of that particular oeuvre. But the concepts of creativity and expression and really emotional power, right? How well can you express yourself as a DM and have your players do the same to their comfort level, weaving a story with real emotional power, that it doesn't just feel like, oh, my character died, that it really makes players feel like their investment in the game is really, really solid. I've never really sort of gotten over this story. I'll make it brief, but before D&D 5e came out, I mean, I played second edition and I played a little bit of third edition. I got back into it at, around fourth edition, played that. And that was very sort of slanted for a specific type of gameplay around miniatures and maps and sort of more tactical based kind of stuff. Much more board game and maybe a little bit of MMORPG style of play. Never really played with players who were sort of so invested that they took on a lot of emotional weight of their characters. But as soon as 5th edition came out and watched that sort of take off, a player in one of my games, we were playing a campaign for a long time, for about 6 or 7 months. And he was very invested in his character, and his friend was also invested in his character. And one of the characters in the campaign was just outright demolished by a trap in this particular campaign. And everyone just sat there stunned after this happened. And I looked over at the player and he was weeping. And I didn't know what to do. I was thinking to myself, oh my God, like, I mean, internally I'm thinking it's a game. And is this guy, like, is he so invested, or is this him theatrical, goodness, great. I can't even think of the word.
Yeah, theatricalizing.
Theatricalizing, thank you.
It's not actoring.
No, not actoring. Amazingly.
Was he actoring the fuck out of it?
I think he was actoring the fuck out of it. No, he was not actoring it. And nor was he acting it. He was sincerely moved by the death of this player's character. And I think that lends to the kind of play style that has been exhibited so far.
Yeah, I will say, interestingly enough, my friends and I played from roughly the ages of 10 to 18. So when we started playing, it was the red box. Then we moved on to first edition. And then at that point, second edition actually came out. And we played second edition from about seventh grade until graduating from high school. And during that time, the internet was existed. The internet was sort of came into being during the course of that period. It was quite primitive. You couldn't go watch people play Dungeons and Dragons on it. There really weren't videos on it yet much. And we didn't know anybody else who played. So we were a self-taught group. We didn't have an example to go by of what the game was supposed to be or how it was meant to be done, or really didn't get to see other people run it, to see different styles. So we only knew the way we played. And what I was stunned at is that I found Mercer's style, and I think the first thing I saw him do was not Critical Role, it was Force Grey. But it was recognizably the style that we would like. I felt like this is quite like what we did, because we played a very character-driven, not very technical, very story-based, and sort of very emotionally invested, and sort of based on the dramatic stuff that we as preteens and then teenagers were into, X-Men, and X-Men is quite emotional and, quite sentimental and sort of character driven and over the top. And, to an extent, Lord of the Rings, or I know Three Musketeers was a big one, or just like whatever whatever was going on in pop culture. And pop culture was, the nerds hadn't won yet at that time. Right. So it really felt like you were in this super secret club for even knowing these things. But I felt like, this is actually kind of reminds me of how our games went, until he took out the really amazing terrain and miniature. We didn't have any of that. So and that was sort of like, oh wow, we never once used minis or sort of grid or it really did tactical combat beyond maybe like drawing a very rough map and then drawing some X's and O's to show where people were standing. But it was really very much a theater of the mind game, and quite scene based and railroady. I don't think we ever, I don't know that I ever really DM'd a dungeon crawl, other than when I, like the very early, when I was like 10 or 11, because you just made a dungeon and that was the story. But from the age of like 12 to 18, I'm sure I didn't do a dungeon crawl. I don't remember ever doing a dungeon crawl in second edition. Do tons of them now in fifth edition, but like that way of sort of having a site-based exploration where you're moving through a very specific map, that part was totally new and was sort of a new dimension. It also struck me as like, oh, they're going to try to shoot this really tiny miniature thing on for video, huh? And that part and to this day, I think rarely works on video. And it's not that it can't, it's just that I feel like they don't ever shoot it right. But I often find like, okay, their style of play is very married to moving those minis around. I really can't see what the fuck is going on because they won't, sort of position the camera correctly. But they're again,
and knock them over.
Right. Again, 15 million people have watched episode 1 of campaign 1, so I'm raw. There are no threat. I mean, I'm no threat to them.
I think that people don't have to be exact. They sort of want to they want to visualize their own scene, even though the minis and the maps are amazing. And, you think to yourself as you see these amazing creations, wow, I wish I had the disposable income to create that kind of a scene. Sure. But I think that it doesn't really matter. No one's going like counting squares and shit. They just want to sort of understand the general scene for their own visual interpretation of what it is that they can put together in their mind.
Yeah. But that's another thing that like you would think if you try to pitch that show to a television executive and they'd be like, what is your show? Well, it's 4 hours long.
Sorry, may I show you the door?
It's 4 hours long. There are no commercials except one 10-minute break in the middle. And it's mostly, it's people just sitting. They just sit and talk for 4 hours. And occasionally they all look at this really tiny thing in front of them that you can't really see that well and move their things around.
And do math. By the way, did I tell you that when they do math? Okay, that's super fun.
Yeah. And that's like prior to the internet and you being able to make your own show and content being king and everyone, the sort of victory of the amateurs, right? because like you'd never get that green lighted in the pre-streaming era. Nobody would put that show on anything.
Well, now social media is all amateurs.
Yeah,
it's
well,
all
that's the thing.
YouTube and TikTok and Facebook and everything is all about.
The moment has arrived, right? Where a show like this can exist.
Yeah.
Like prior to 2008, there couldn't have been an Acquisitions Inc. Prior to 2014, 2015, there couldn't have been an Adventure Zone or Critical Role. But now there's a confluence of people that are capable of doing it really well and the media for disseminating it.
Mm-hmm.
Did either of you go to the live event in New York City? It was like 2 years ago, right before
the one in Harlem.
Yes.
Yeah, I went to that. Yeah.
It was amazing because we got there early, and the people that work there, we would talk to them and they couldn't understand what we were actually watching because they're used to seeing, big music acts and
it was a concert hall. I forget what the venue was. There was a really cool venue in Harlem.
Oh, it was a great venue.
It wasn't. No, I was thinking it was the Beacon, but no, it's not the Beacon.
No, it was way uptown.
Yeah, I'll have to find it.
It was way uptown. It's a beautiful old theater, great restaurants in the area too. But they kept saying, "What is this? What is happening?" And I was explaining to them, and they just looked at me like, "Okay, he's kidding." Like I was joking. And then when they came out and they just had tables and a screen, you could look at the staff, and their mouths were hanging open, like, what is happening? And we would all laugh at certain jokes like bidet and things like that. Mm-hmm. And they were just shaking their heads like, I don't understand this in any way. And I think it's just impossible to explain. You just have to watch. Kind of like playing the game.
A rabid audience, of course. It wasn't Harlem. It was the United Palace in Washington Heights.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Very convenient for me. It was very, very easy to get to for us because it was so far uptown.
It was pretty easy for me too, so I was like, great.
Yeah, and it was like, if you've seen the live shows, you see how fanatical the following was.
But there was no combat or anything, though. It was
they did not do any matches.
Just RP.
It was a completely narrative show.
Yeah,
it was very good, and I'm glad. I'm glad I went because who knows when they'll be able to do one again. Unfortunately, I'm sure they'll be back, in New York at some point, but certainly we haven't had it for, 2 years because of COVID. I think what I was going to say earlier, so Critical Role is now an often imitated show. And because Critical Role is so organic and uncut and unedited and freewheeling, I think it has led a lot of other streamers to be like, we just need to throw some cameras on our game. And it'll work and it'll be watchable. And I think that people don't realize they have these essential lightning in a bottle qualities of being performers, having performers' instincts, having charisma, having the ability to connect with fans, and being storytellers. Mercer being sort of one of the great DMs of our generation in his own right. Like all of these things that bring us to the table, this shouldn't work. Like you cannot put a camera and mics on just 6 Dungeons and Dragons players for 4 hours, not edited at all, just throw it on the internet and think that an audience will be able to enjoy it, in my opinion. So I think if you're not Critical Role, you can't necessarily get away with what Critical Role does. And I think
not in a long-term sense, that's for certain.
Right.
Yeah.
My biggest issue with a lot of the shows is I tune in, the visuals look great. I'm like, okay, the idea is great, but the sound is terrible, especially with everybody logging in now. And it gets to the point where one person's so loud and one person's so soft, and I'm constantly adjusting my mic and then or my speaker, and then I just get aggravated and leave.
Yeah. Sound is a massive, if you don't have the right sound, I don't care how amazing your setup is with performance.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the podcast that we do, boy, has that been an eye opener for me in terms of, and again, we have the luxury of doing post-production and the episodes that people hear, that's a couple of months after our recording sessions. Yeah. Just leveling everybody, making sure everyone's track, fixing it and getting it so that no one's yelling over everybody else. It does not come out of the oven like that. Like even this show, which is, whatever, we're just talking, like I'll levelate it and stuff later. If we put this out live, people would be pissed at us.
Yeah.
Because it's inevitably like one person is like, and then Monty Martin is like, so everybody, what are we doing?
He is so loud sometimes.
Well, he comes in so hot. I don't know.
He does.
I love Monty Martin. God bless him. He comes in so hot, and then he always drops. And I really wish, and Dungeon Dudes, I love you, and you also have 1 million more followers than I will ever have. Please level at your videos.
They've gotten better. He used to come
Dungeons
so
and
hot
Dragon
on Dungeon Dudes.
available in
He was so loud.
stores.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that there is a technical skill that you need to develop when you perform either on the internet or even live, that you need to practice at, and it will, you will not, in some sense of the word, you will fail, but that is not something that you should ever sort of say to yourself, okay, well, I'm done. I suck at it. And
I'll be bad at it, so I shouldn't try.
Yeah,
right?
no.
That'll defeat any creative endeavor.
Right.
Of course.
I shouldn't try writing something because it won't succeed. No one will. I mean, that you cannot let that impede you from being creative. But,
nor should you, even if you are technically astute, right, and have a fantastic product, and throw it out there on the internet expecting the droves of D&D fans to come flocking to your door, and then maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 people go, oh, it was pretty good. Like, you think, oh, I have failed myself, I have failed my friends, because I have not done the deed. I have not performed D&D at the level of X. And you're like,
yeah, and that's not a reflection of your creative or artistic ability at all, right? That's kind of a reflection of your marketing reach, your marketing ability, which is a completely different skill set, which you also still need. But that doesn't mean your show is bad.
no.
That just means you're not reaching an audience for whatever reason.
We mentioned that Critical Role live show before. I don't know if either of you guys were at the pre-show. There was a Q&A before the show.
Yeah, no, I was not.
And all their mics went out. All the sound went out. So they had no sound for the first hour. So they walked up to the edge of the stage and they just dangled their feet off the stage. And it was only the first, 10, 15 rows for that portion of the show. And
that whole show was a technical shit show.
I remember. Didn't the lights go out or something like that at one point?
The stream failed.
Yeah.
If you weren't there live, and they never recovered it.
Oh my God.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, the only people who really saw that episode were the people in that theater. The second half of the episode did not air and was never recoverable. It was just like a disaster. And it made me feel a little better about myself, to be honest, because I thought, wow, this is like the highest of high end outfits. And this was a real technical meltdown.
Yeah.
And I feel bad sometimes when, we have a small nonprofit theater company, Red Monkey Theater Group that, Matt and I have done a bunch of shows for. And, technical shit happens and you can really get down on yourself if light cues get blown or somebody doesn't preset a knife and Matt has to strangle you to death instead of stabbing you. But that happens at every level of creativity and performance and production. Sure. Every level of artistic endeavor has major technical meltdowns. So that's, I think, nothing for anyone to get discouraged about.
I got discouraged that I didn't get to stab you.
But you got to strangle him. That's pretty good.
I mean, Matt, I don't know how we did that. And hats off to you.
Hats off to you.
Was it two hands or how did you do it? Yeah. 2 hands or elbow?
No, I got it. I one-handed, Darth Vader style. Come on.
We'll cover that in the strangling episode in 2 weeks.
Can't wait for that one.
But back to what I think we consider to be the merits to this peanut butter and jelly, or I should say maybe peanut butter and chocolate, depending on your allergies, of Dungeons and Dragons and performance, marrying the two together, and why I think what works and what doesn't. How about that? Right?
Yeah.
Like perfect example, ready? Live action role playing. Now, live action role playing, as far as we are aware, is a role playing game that is played live and is to some degree, it is performance enabled, but it is not the kind of D&D that certainly brings in the fans. In fact, at one point, although perhaps it was a little bit of a precursor to this kind of understanding of how to play D&D or any kind of RPG in this regard. It was widely mocked, right? Oh my God, he LARPs? That's like beyond the beyond. That's like the nth
It was
of
very
nerddom.
stigmatized. Yeah, I wish we had Dan, who was on the show last month, because Dan's a major into LARPing. I wish he was here. He could tell us all about it. I did it once. Have you ever done it?
No, I've seen it done. I mean, I've gone
never
to
done it
the closest I've come is like the Renaissance Fair, which is not LARPing, but it's
not. It's but it's in a there's Convergent Evolution between Renaissance fairs and LARPing. So I did it once, and this was a long time ago. This was maybe like I think summer of '94, like maybe summer after graduating high school, before college. I went to one with a couple of friends of mine we played D&D with, and there were flyers in the Dungeons and Dragons comic book store for this thing. I don't know that it was even called LARP. I assume it was called LARPing then, but that's what it was.
Yeah.
And we made these weapons they're all nerfed up, and we had armor, and we wrote backstories. I've never been so miserable.
Really?
Why?
And it was, we didn't really know what we were doing. In retrospect, what we probably should have done is like volunteered to be part of the NPC group, so that they maybe would have taken us in hand a little bit and sort of showed us how things work, and we could sort of help tell the story from that end, as opposed to just going as players. It's funny because I was a theater kid and I had plenty of Dungeons and Dragons experience, and within an hour of getting there, I was just like, I'm in the wrong fucking place. How quickly can I get? And it was like a week. So we were there for like 2 days. It was like an overnight, like in a cabin and everything. And I was like, I got to get out of here.
Was it just too self-referential, maybe? It wasn't sort of distanced from the overall idea of we're playing a game. It was maybe too into it. I don't even know. Like, I don't have any reference to...
People were certainly very committed. God love them. Like, people were very much in character, and they had obviously been doing it for years, and there were hundreds of people there.
Sure.
And they, for the most part, they were enjoying it, but there wasn't really... I didn't feel drawn in by any kind of narrative. It was never quite clear what we were meant to be doing. Although occasionally there were just like massive battles where everyone was whacking each other with Nerf weapons.
Right.
I never had a sense of really what was going on. Or I also was the thing where like it seemed like everyone else except us had been doing it for years, had like 14th level characters. There wasn't a good on ramp, I guess is the way that I would put it for someone who had never done it before.
Was there? Here's a question.
Yes.
Besides the fact that you felt distanced from that form of sort of performative role playing, did you feel that storytelling was a large part of it, or was it just we're going out, we're going to try to beat the guys with our foam swords, and this guy's an orc, and this guy plays a wizard, and he's 14th level, and he casts lightning bolt, lightning bolt, lightning bolt. If you don't get the joke, look on the internet.
Yeah.
And then, there was no real sort of flow through of story, right?
I do feel like there were some stories going on. I just we couldn't, my two friends who I was there with, we couldn't really figure out how to access them. It was like they were not for us. They were sort of for the people who were going to this every month or however often they had done it, and were very invested in the copious amount of lore that it was not that friendly for a new person. It felt like walking in on act 3 of a movie and just being handed here, go beat that thing. That's part of the cataclysm of the something territory. Like there was actually like a lot of shit, going on as far as like actions and lore and stuff like that. We just didn't know any of it, and it was pretty opaque for someone who was not a veteran. And it was also just like, oh, this is fucking hot. It was summer, you're slogging around, and costumes kind of falling apart a little bit. Because it seems funny, because it would seem to be a confluence of like I do stage combat, like I like to do that kind of thing. I like role playing games. I like theater. So it was like this should be ticking all the boxes, and I couldn't wait to go home.
Wow, interesting. Okay. Well,
now mind you, that was 1994, so I don't think that's really any commentary on what it's like today.
Certainly not. I think that I would like to see how if LARPing has in some way or another, or live action role playing. I don't know if like saying the word LARPing is somewhat derogative or not, but I don't know.
I don't think it is.
I'm hoping not. If that has influenced to some degree, and I think it has certainly influenced, for example, people who play the game in costume, cosplaying has certainly influenced that kind of thing to sort of really get into your character, inhabit your character space, even though you on the outside know that like this guy's not like, he's not Meisnering the hell out of himself. He's not like so into his character that he's like, okay, we're going to call a break, and he's still in his character. Like, it's very clear that this is a player who's wearing some really cool clothing maybe, and really inhabiting the character when they are in it. But I think I'd like to see how, if anything, how this kind of performative version of role playing that has become so, epidemically large within the role playing game community has affected things like LARPing. Has it become perhaps more indicative of that kind of really sort of bringing people in at a more communal level and relieving some of the problems that it had when you first joined it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think in general, things that would only have existed as a subject of mockery and were sneered at when we were teenagers, when we were coming of age, those things are very acceptable now. But that, I feel like that fandom in that way has conquered. That's sort of defining pop culture now, and it's no longer, something like Comic-Con in the 80s or 90s would be viewed very differently than it is now.
Do you think, and this is a question for both of you, this is a question actually for both of you, that although there still are, much to my chagrin, a lot of people in the role-playing game community who feel like their role is to gatekeep the form of Dungeons and Dragons as it used to be, and that Dungeons and Dragons, and for that matter, all role-playing in a 2021 world, quote unquote, ain't what it used to be as it was when it first started in the editions prior. Do you feel like that is the kind of, I guess, material understanding that we need to sort of really work against? I mean, it's sort of clear from the question, I guess, but I guess, how best to put it? If you have these individuals who feel like the game that they remember was better as this particular idea, right? This
Sure.
You don't need to like really role play it. You don't need to make it a performance. And now you have a different animal in 2021. Like, which is the preferred way of doing it? I mean, is it an evolution or is it a demarcation point?
So I would argue that there were always groups, just like me and my friends, that really leaned into the role playing. And I don't think we were unique in that way. I think that from quite early on, and I think this is certainly typified more by the sort of Tracy Hickman, style adventures like Dragonlance and Ravenloft. But you gotta remember, that shit's like 1982, 83. Sure. Like, that comes in fairly early, and there clearly were people playing in a very, sort of character-driven role-playing way. Now, I think what's happened is these two groups can now see each other. Right. You were more siloed, when pre-internet there, you really had to work to, maybe go to conventions and you would see other styles of play, but it wasn't, the average person didn't necessarily have a perception of like, this is how most people are playing. This is the right or wrong way to do this. I think gatekeeping in either direction is bad. I agree. Obviously.
Right.
And I think that, yes, of course, there shouldn't be, you don't want to see, and you still do see, people essentially being comic book guy from The Simpsons, right? Like, please do not touch the display case. It contains a rare copy of Mary Worth in which she has advised a friend to commit suicide. Like that sort of.
Wow, you know that way too well. My God,
you will never know no groaning in my store. Like, you will never have the cred with that guy.
Right.
But I think, and I think that guy shouldn't be bad, wrong funning people who don't play the game the way he likes it and he remembers it. But I also think that fundamentally, that person should also be treated with some sensitivity, because I think, and this is going to sound funny, but I think that guy is a little scared or a little threatened that something he loves, he's being told it's bad. The way you play is bad. Like, I don't necessarily even think he's being told that, but when he sees this, what to him is a new style, a style he can't necessarily execute,
right,
or keep up with, he feels like, well, gee, D&D, the way that's my youth, right? That's sort of my childhood. And I view this evolution as an attack on something that's very precious to me. And unfortunately, he's sort of expressing that in a very unhelpful way that doesn't make you want to sympathize with him.
Right. Yeah. Change is scary to this guy.
You know? Yeah, change is scary to this guy. And I think not every person who's gatekeeping is necessarily the worst person in the world. And there are some that maybe you can talk to and say, I'm not going to, nobody's taking your game away. Right. Like you're not evil because you like to, just do dungeon crawls and kill goblins. Like, you should be allowed to have your game. I invite you to try my game, and you might like it. Conversely, maybe at some point I feel like playing, just some old school, there are no moral questions here, Dungeons and Dragons, like a dungeon crawl for an afternoon. I think that the tent should be big enough to include both of those things. But yes, it is unfortunate when people who, like this fucking, this Ernie Gygax bullshit that's blowing up. That's a perfect example of that, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know that
the sort of, it's the Ernie Gygax recently picked up the TSR trademark, which somebody had let lapse, and within the space of a week, so thoroughly embarrassed himself with a mixture of essentially saying, like, I don't hold with the newfangled attempts to, like, basically make Dungeons and Dragons less racist and less misogynistic. This is not my dad's game. Essentially saying, like, my dad was good with all that stuff, and he just came off looking really bad, and basically had to sort of run and hide on social media within a week of taking over the brand, and now they're pretty much have no future. With TS, and that was really an example of the sort of thing Matt's I think talking the worst case scenario, or like, you have to do it like we did it in 1976, where evil was evil and women had a cap of 17 strength.
It's funny because I started playing when I was little, and we played out of the little white box. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the little white box.
I have seen it. I did not own it, but I saw it. I was envious of those who had it.
I own it now only because my mom's husband sent me his from when he was in the Navy.
Oh my gosh.
In the 70s. So I have those really old books. Fighter is called Fighting Man.
Yep. Yes. It's rules light. So we actually.
It is rules light. Yeah.
We got tired of just doing a dungeon crawl, and in one room there's a Medusa, in the next room there's a dragon, in the next room there's a gelatinous cube, and we're just like, okay, this is just stupid. So because like, why would these things live together? First of all, but we started making our own stories, and we didn't have anybody else to play with, so we didn't know what we were doing. So we were actually role playing and creating these stories and these narratives way back then, because we didn't have rules and we didn't have money, so we couldn't afford the new books. The hardcovers started coming out. We couldn't afford them. They were like $20. Forget that. So I'm not really sure what Ernie's talking about, because we picked up that first edition and played, and we went right into role play.
Yeah.
And it was fun. And to me, that's what Dungeons and Dragons was. It was us sitting around making a story, laughing with your friends. That's what I loved about it. When it got a little rules heavy, I got a little bored, like in 3.5. I think it's 3.5. I know people love 3.5, but it was so rules heavy that it's like, okay, just spending all my time calculating stuff and figuring stuff out.
I don't think that the idea, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Andy, but I don't think the idea that a role-playing game ought not to have role play. Like, that's part and parcel of the game, right? We're seeing you are playing a role, but it's not just the sort of construct of, okay, Jimmy, you're playing the fighter. Jenny, you're playing the thief. Like, these are roles, these are classes, these are ideas that are put upon you so that you're no longer just Jimmy walking through a dungeon. Obviously, that's kind of the context of the game. but it's the context of performance, I think, that sort of is the new black, so to speak.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'm questioning whether or not, if you took a guy from 1974 and put him in a new, if you put him in the concept of looking at this game, a Critical Role game, or a Dimension 20 game, or anything that resembles what we see now as a quote unquote good, well produced performance style live play, what would he think? I wonder.
I think there might be two different reactions. I think some of those people would say, "This is so great. I was right. Like, I knew everyone would love this if they just saw it. And I am so proud to have been there at the genesis of what is now this huge community of fans, and has become accepted and has really been therapeutic for a lot of people and fun for a lot of people, and gotten some people through hard times and created friendship, and has now become this big mega thing." I think that's one reaction. I think another reaction might be, they took it from me.
Interesting.
Now it's the people who picked on me are famous for playing Dungeons and Dragons, like this beautiful, cool, funny, popular athletes, sort of social achievers, right? These people look like models. There are a lot of very pretty people playing D&D on live streams, and people playing to play with them, or paying to play with them, or paying to watch them play. And I think some people would be like, this was our thing, and now it's been we made it up, we created it, and now they took it and they're making money with it. It's just become another thing to enhance their power, their standing, and I'm still here.
When I started playing, one of the guys I played with was 6'6", like 250 pounds. He was in the Army, and he was actually a machine gunner on a helicopter. Not the kind of guy you would expect a football player, not the kind of guy you expect to play D&D. But that group I played with were interesting because they were all people you wouldn't expect, except for me and my friend I grew up with. You wouldn't expect to play, but everyone did keep it secret. That was our thing. And I think people back then would react to, how are you going on this thing called the internet and telling everybody you play this game? Aren't they going to pick on you? Aren't they going to?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. I mean, that my group that we played with. I mean, my friend Jonah, Matt, that you went to college with. I mean, Jonah was the captain of the football team and the president of the student council, and
there you go.
We were all on the fucking homecoming court or whatever. We weren't like social outcast kids, but we absolutely did not tell people we played D&D. It just because we didn't want to deal with it. It was something you would have caught some shit for.
I find the interesting confluence between D&D as a game, right? Well, role-playing game where you sit around playing with friends. A good, I would say, a good portion, not enormous, but a certain subset of those players turned out to be people who liked to, speak in funny accents and tell stories and have certain characterizations. They ended up sort of being theater kids. And then, once you were a theater kid, if at a certain point in our relatively recent past, before D&D became enormously popular, like if you had played D&D, you sort of shunned that particular history, right? You sort of were like, I mean, I played it in college, you sort of shrug it off and that kind of thing. But I'm really, I'm a theater person. I'm an actor. But as soon as the performative element of D&D came out and became this enormously popular way of transmitting this game, just the droves of theater kids, that's why it's so popular in LA and New York and all these other places that are just theater meccas, just ran in from all sides to showcase how much they loved this game. And it's amazing.
Yeah. I also think, I stopped for more than 20 years, but it wasn't because I didn't want to play. It was just because my life was just not, I couldn't accommodate that. I was just too busy, and I didn't have the luxury of time or frankly the money to spend on it for a long time, or necessarily the sort of network of people to play it with.
Yeah, I would have kept playing if I knew people, and that was my problem too. I moved. When you're in your early 20s, you move around a couple times, and I didn't know anybody.
Yeah,
it wasn't like I was going to go around advertising. I play D&D. Now I wear D&D T-shirts, and people walk up to me and like, "You play D&D?" I'm like, "Yeah."
Yeah. But usually, I was day job 9 to 5, and then usually in rehearsal 5 nights a week, or five rehearsals a week, and evenings and weekends, and that was what I was up to. And you're getting married and you're moving, all the stuff that Andy said.
Mm-hmm.
I think it really took until I was in my early 40s where my life sort of settled down again to the point where I was able to do something like this. And also, the fact that you can play online obviously makes things easier for a lot of people, particularly in our age group, I think.
Yeah. Right.
So we are well over an hour, and I did want to. I feel like we haven't talked that much, and I don't want to go too much later with it, but I did want to touch a little bit on. We've now been doing this show for 9 months.
Wow.
Podcast Party: Descent into Avernus. How is it different to do Dungeons and Dragons as a show than just playing it as a game with your friends?
Want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, definitely.
So when I play D&D, I get lost in my character. So to me, it's, other than the technical stuff with the mic and that sort of stuff, it's not really much different. I just play my character, and I get lost in it. I was a little worried because we had a live performance, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, and I didn't know how that was going to go because that was my first one. But again, it was the same thing. I was into my character, and it didn't faze me in it at all playing it for theater. Am I the exception?
That is interesting. It is different, right? We did a live show. That's different from when we're just doing the podcast and there's no immediate audience.
Right.
There's some different energy, obviously, when you've got people physically sitting there. Matt and I have played a few live shows before. For me, it does not feel that different. Although, of course, there's a post-production aspect of it that doesn't exist normally. And then it does feel more like, okay, this is a show I'm working on. But when we're playing, I think, if anything, I'm probably a bit more focused and a bit more disciplined to stay in character as much as I can, to stay focused, to sort of try to keep things in game and moving, because I am aware that fucking around creates more work in post-production. So I'd say if it were just a casual game where obviously there might be a little more crosstalk, during the game, I might break character a little more than I do when we're doing the show. So I think if anything, it's sort of just, it makes me more focused, a little bit closer to how I feel when I'm doing a show. When it's like, okay, I have a responsibility here to honor the listener and to honor my castmates, the other players, the DM and the editor and all of that. Like, this is not if I waste time, it's not my own time I'm wasting. Like, I'm creating, I'm conscious of, like, I don't want to disrespect the audience. I don't want to disrespect the people that I'm playing with. And I don't want to create more work for myself and carry in post-production, frankly.
Right.
So I think, like, much like when I'm working on a show, I know if I'm an actor, especially if I've got a big, or any size part, really, I know that there's a lot of crew that want me to hit my shit, hit my, be where I'm supposed to be, know my lines, like, sort of hold up my end of the show. So I think it's not a bad kind of pressure, but I'm just that much more focused on staying in the role and playing the game sincerely. And I might be a little more relaxed if we were just, well, I mean, you've all played with me casually, right? So it's a little more laid back, and
sure, you can wander out and get a piece of pizza or
exactly, yeah,
just bullshit for 10 minutes. Everyone can bullshit around the table for 10 minutes, and it's like, who cares? Right, right.
Yeah, I think from a dungeon master's perspective, I certainly have much more focus on making sure that the from a technical perspective that everything is aligned to what I would hope an audience would want to hear. Does it sound good? Are the concepts well laid out? Do I have everything that I need that an audience member would be able to listen to any episode of the podcast and go, oh, that's interesting. Or, okay, I get that. Rather than, I don't understand what the hell this guy's talking about. Or, when was that? Were they talking about something? I don't get it. So without being pedantic, right? Because this is an audience that I'm pretty sure if they haven't understood what D&D is, we don't need to spoon feed it to them. They'll get it eventually just from our play. So that the concept of dungeon mastering for a podcast is not like, this is a dice. You have roll and you roll high. I don't want to do that to any audience member.
Sure,
I want to make sure that the idea of what we're putting together is very clear. That's the number one goal in my mind whenever we sit down is clarity, whether it be technical clarity or story clarity. And then the second is, without forcing it, because I know you guys all have fun, is does it sound like we're having fun? Like I'm trying to make sure everybody's having fun. That's the key thing from my perspective as to whenever I hear really great things about the podcast is you guys all sound really like you, number one, know each other relatively well, which is always good from an audience's perspective. That you have a great rapport, right? That you're able to talk and bounce off. Nobody sounds like they're sitting in the back going, I don't want to be here, or is uncomfortable. And that they have a relatively well, they're relatively well versed with the game and its concepts. No one's like taking their time and trying to figure things out. But of course, that's due to a lot of post-production work that you guys have, just the magic and artistry of that to make it sound so amazing. But it's also that, does it sound like these guys are having a good time? Because I'll tell you, that's the magic sauce between any listener or viewer of any performance game and the art that you're seeing. Is this pleasing to me? Right. And I think that if it's pleasing, you'll continue to watch it. You'll continue to listen to it.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's chemistry. Right. And I think something I would advise anyone who's doing this to do, which we did, which I'm really happy that we did. And the listeners won't necessarily know this, but we played an entire off-air campaign, Dragon of Ice Spire Peak, before doing the show.
Right.
And I think it's very important to do that. We also did a pilot, a 2-part pilot, as if we were going to do this as a podcast, which never aired. Maybe it will someday because it's actually pretty good.
Yeah, it's not bad.
But it was also, I think, really important to do that. Like the first session 1 that the listeners heard was not the first time we played together and was not the first time we recorded together.
Right.
And I think that's sort of, it seems fairly obvious, but I think not everyone would necessarily know it's important to do that. And I really am glad that we did. And I would really recommend that to anyone who wants to do a D&D show. Just play the game first, make sure that you have some chemistry and the play styles are relatively complementary, and make a pilot episode or two. Don't be trying to learn don't be learning during the thing that the public is watching, basically. No, try to know what you're doing first.
Try to know what you're doing.
I will say, I'm thinking about it now, and I think maybe this is a little bit writer-director brain.
Okay.
But because I'm a little more conscious of the show as a narrative piece than I might be if it were just a game, sometimes for Renaissance, I think about there are things that are gamey that I want to try to make narrative sense in a way that will be rewarding in a small way for the listener. So, like, for example, I realized, I'm going to pick up a couple of cantrips next level, and I think I'm going to take guidance, and Corbin is doing this spell. Like, from the listener's perspective, is that going to be weird that all of a sudden I just start doing this thing? Like, why wasn't I doing that the first 4 episodes?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I do sometimes try to set that up. Like, I think there's an episode where I start sort of asking Corbin, like, can you show me how to do that?
You did it. I think you did it 2 or 3 times, and it really works because I'm re-listening for a reason I'm not going to talk about to the early episodes. And you set it up, and I go, oh, I forgot he set that up. That's so beautiful. It's really nice. But that's you into your character and going, my character wants to do this too. And it works very well.
But I think that some of that stuff is because I am thinking this needs to make sense to a third party. right? Like I wouldn't necessarily worry about justifying the level up abilities narratively if we were just playing casually.
You know, that's an
But I
interesting
sort of-
thing, though. But
that's a good
I
point.
think that, number one, even if we had no audience, even if we had no one listening or watching or anything like that, I think it would make sense not only from your stories, from your character's stories perspective.
It completely would make sense. I'm just saying, Tal may not have bothered to do it.
You know, that's interesting, though,
you know,
because
the show makes me more likely to do stuff like that.
And I think that's great in general to do. I think that one should not need to think, okay, well, I'm doing a game, and so therefore I need to have the audience understand where I'm getting these, because it's from a narrative perspective, it's really cool to bring in new abilities and speak about them narratively. And I love the lead up to new powers and new abilities. I like that a lot, right? Especially as a storyteller. You can do that in your own games. Like you can, you know, rather than I've leveled up, I've learned new spells. Bing, I'm done.
Yeah.
There we go. It's, you know, you can say, for example.
Absolutely. And I think moving forward as a player, I would be more likely to do things like that, even in non-performance games.
Yeah.
But prior to this experience, that is something more that only really as a DM would I be thinking in those terms. So it's interesting to be thinking a little bit in those terms as a player. And I think that cantrip thing is something that has already sort of paid off. There are a couple of other things that I've planted seeds for as Renaissance that may or may not come to fruition. But if they do, I think the audience will then be able to say, oh, wow, he was thinking about that months ago. And that's why he did that thing. So that, I think, maybe is something that I would carry forward into non-performance games, but definitely did evolve from the fact that this one is a performance. And it made me think, what will the audience, how can I help the audience understand why these things are happening?
It was funny too, because you asked Corbin about it and he said it took him 10 years to learn guidance.
That's right.
And then like the next episode you're using it. I like that. I also think Carrie's doing a really interesting job with her character. Instead of just instantly getting her new abilities, they're like coming out of her at certain times. And that's, as someone else playing in the game, it's really fun to listen to that because I know what her character can do because I've read the book. But it's really fun when it finally comes out and I'm like, oh, there it is. That's cool.
Well, it's the universal like show, don't tell kind of thing, especially in this kind of an art form. And I do consider this thing that we are doing as a podcast, look, I'm going to call it what I think it is, which is that I think that role-playing game in this, especially in this regard, is an art form. Storytelling is an art form. And so we are doing that, right? Look, if we're leaning towards the storytelling aspects of the game, we want to really enhance that through what we're doing in a podcast rather than I roll 2 dice, I hit. Okay. How much damage? 20 damage. Okay. Awesome. He's dead. Right. We don't do that. We actually lend it to the storytelling. So, you know, if other kinds of storytelling is art, why not role-playing games?
Yeah,
absolutely. We just don't have the story planned out. We don't know where it's going.
That's the best part of it, though.
Yeah,
that's the best part of it.
I agree.
Even Matt doesn't know everything.
I have no idea. Look, I may, and in all seriousness, I have a framework. I have the adventure, and even people who have made their own adventures, they will have a framework. We will not be able to predict any roll of the die that occurs in the game. And that is the improvisational nature of the art form that we are putting together, right? It's the yes and. It's if someone presents something to you, you say yes to that, you accept the premise that they're putting forward and you build on it. And that's the great thing about the game. That's what keeps us surprised and enjoying the game as much as anybody who listens to it.
Cool. Well, we're around the hour 20. So I feel like that's a great place to stop. Thank you, Andy and Matt, so much for joining me. This was another great conversation.
Thank you.
I will get this posted for everybody in the bonus section of the website in the next couple of days. And we will be back here next month, the last Wednesday of the month at 9 p.m.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for doing another Power Word Talk. Can't wait for the next one.
Thanks. Awesome. That was my first one. So.
Oh, yay.
Yay. It was super fun.
It was great to have you. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks, everybody.